everybody. Over the last year or so, I have been inducted, thanks to my wonderful audience, to the fabulous and rather interesting world of Maserati. In that time, I've been able to sample a few different cars and even wound up buying one myself, a Quattroporte Sport GTS, which is now my sort of daily driver. In truth, I don't actually have such a thing as a daily driver, but that's really the closest I'm ever likely to come. Many of the cars I've driven have been part of the 3200, 4200 family. This was a very important model line for Maserati and was the first introduced under their new owners, Ferrari. Not long before, Maserati had been bought by Fiat, who then gave it to Ferrari and said, look, can you make something out of this? Tell them how to do things properly. To date, I've driven the 3200 automatic, a 3200 Assetto Corsa with the manual gearbox, and a 4200, or what's actually called the Coupe. Now, all of those cars had a lot to like about them. I think they're very pretty. They're actually reasonably spacious. They've got good back seats, if not spectacular boots. For quite some time, the price difference between, say, a nice Maserati from the late 90s and a ropey Ferrari of the same time wasn't that great. You'd be paying 10 to 15 for a good Mazda and about 20 to 25 for a ropey Ferrari 456. However, that price gap has really widened, particularly if you insist on having a manual Ferrari. You'd now easily be paying about 60,000 quid to get your hands on a 456. That means that one of these, at around say 20 to 30,000 pounds, looks like pretty good value. Today's car is the Maserati Gransport, the swan song of the 32-4200 lineage. Italian manufacturers have a long and storied history of introducing models that probably weren't quite ready for sale, and then over the next few years refining them to the point where they became the car they always should have been. My Quattroporte, as an example, it fixes all of the problems the original had. However, because the first time out was really that bad, it's still stuck with the same poor reputation. My Alfa Romeo 147, much the same. The original cars didn't get very good reviews at all, but over the years Alfa improved it, added new things like a Q2 differential and made it a very, very good car. But by that stage, everyone had already forgotten about it already and decided they didn't want one. The original 3200 was blighted with an engine that was somewhat binary in its response, a reputation for very, very poor reliability, extraordinarily high running costs, and dynamics that really did leave an awful lot to be desired. The Coupe, or 4200, changed things quite a bit. It was the first time we saw the all-new Ferrari Maserati engine, the F136, so it's a 4.2 litre in that car, as it is here, made then 385 horsepower, this one's 395, and put out 333 pound-foot of torque. It's about 450 newton meters. Controversially, the Coupe also lost the 3200's distinctive and I think quite sexy boomerang lights, and no one ever admitted really what the actual reasoning behind that was. Some people say Luca di Montezemolo just didn't like them, and other people say the Americans wouldn't allow them. And as the original car wasn't sold in America, and this was, that may be part of the reasoning behind the change. The 4200 that I drove, a manual, was definitely a better, more exciting car to drive than the 32. However, it still shared one of that car's key problems, which is its skyhook adaptive suspension. Curiously, Ferrari also use skyhook suspension, but they always seem to get it right. This, to me, proves the theory that Maserati was only ever really a testbed for Ferrari, and that's probably the same reason that for this car, they ditched the automatic box you could get in the 3200 and offered instead what they called Cambio Corsa. To Ferrari owners, we'd know that as the F1 box. It's a single clutch automated manual system that you must remember at the time was still fairly new. It has to be said that no matter where that gearbox was found, in the early days it didn't receive an awful lot of love. Maserati persevered, they kept working on the system until they refined it to a point where it was actually pretty decent. Unfortunately, the only Maserati I've driven thus far where I really liked it was a GranTurismo, the car that replaced this and actually is based on the Quattroporte, so it's a much, much bigger thing. Gearboxes are important to talk about because with the Gransport, your only option was the Cambio Corsa. You couldn't get one of these in a manual. So what else is different about the Gransport? Well, quite a few things. The engine, like I said, is up by about 10 horsepower. They've got some aerodynamic additions, so a nice, more aggressive front end, which I quite like. A little lip spoiler at the back that really does make this car look, just brilliant. This blue Mediterranean paint also, by the way, is the only one I'd have. It's absolutely spectacular. The interior's got some carbon fibre thrown at it. Got a little bit of carbon on the wheel here, a bit of carbon here, a bit of carbon here. And it does feel very much Ferrari-like inside. There's leather on the roof lining. It's a really, really nice upmarket place to be. Now, if you remember that at the time this was being made, Porsche was still just about making the 996. And compare the interior of that and this, they are a world apart. This really does feel like a much nicer car. This one's also been very well cared for, and I'm particularly grateful to Dan and his partner for bringing it out, because it's actually her car. He has a Quattroporte, she has this, and they switch between the two depending on what they need. Nice pair of his and hers cars to have, I must say. I'm going to start with this car in regular mode and talk you through it. Driving at slow speeds, it's not a happy bunny. Gear changes take an age and they're not particularly smooth. A couple of the shifts feel like they've been rammed home, which is not very necessary when you're in a car park. The biggest problem I had with the older cars was a real delay in steering response. So the cars were very sharp handling, but it seemed like there was a half a second pause between you turning the wheel and the car actually doing anything. This initially feels like it's just a little bit better set up. It sits 10mm lower than the regular car and is sharpened up just a touch. At the time of release, Maserati didn't really say too much about what they'd done with this car, simply that it was the ultimate evolution of the Coupe. Opinions of these do vary wildly, with some saying it's the car Maserati should have always made, and others, like my friend Jack from number 27, saying that it was yet another disappointment and, aside from a fantastic exhaust note, not really much of a car to remember. I've got to say, in terms of ride quality, when you're just bimbling along at 50-odd mile an hour, it's very, very comfortable, exceptionally well damped, and soaks up the lumps and the bumps in the road really nicely. The gearbox, left to its own devices and in normal mode, is absolutely awful though. But this car isn't really designed to be driven in normal mode. It's designed to be driven in sport. And a Ferrari of the time is a very different thing when you press that button. So let's do the same here and find out how it changes things. First off, you'll notice a lot more noise. From 4,000 RPM and above, even the regular mode will let the valves in the exhaust open. But in sport mode, they're open all the time, meaning you get the most glorious soundtrack. Now in my Ferrari, giving it a little blip on the downshifts does help. In here, I don't think so. In sport mode, it does it just right on its own. However, like the Ferrari, if you're at full tilt, I would say leave your foot in for upshifts. Anything less than that, so if you're just bimbling along, then yes, do lift off, do help the gearbox. It's still not a quick change, and I would say is on par maybe with a Ferrari 360. It's probably better than the 355. It's not maybe as good as the Challenge Stradale, and it's certainly a far cry from the Scuderia. You can certainly sense the extra stiffness from the suspension in sport mode. It's certainly quick though, this thing. That engine is really smooth, plenty of power, and it revs with a surprising keenness. Very different thing to the unit Ferrari used. This is a cross-plane crank, they had flat-plane cranks. This is a 4.2 litre, which is a displacement Ferrari never used. For roads like this, the earlier cars also sized quite nicely. Because the GranTurismo is based on the Quattroporte, it's essentially the same size, which means it's massive and can feel a touch unwieldy on your average country B road. To get into reverse is the same as a Ferrari of the period, so you pull this piddly little lever down here. It is at low speeds and for manoeuvres where I think this gearbox really does feel its worst. You can sense that it's working very hard to do fairly simple things, and it doesn't cover itself in glory. Let's pull from fairly low down, although in truth it is an engine that thrives on revs, and the harder you drive this car, the better it gets. If you want to simply poodle about, the Quattroporte is a much better choice. response, I would say, is actually no longer a problem here, and it does feel very at home on these roads. Throttle and brake respond really nicely in this car. You need a little bit of travel on the brake pedal to slow you down, but that's how I prefer my cars. Modulation is very easy, and at long last this car gives you the confidence to push it the previous ones really lacked. The steering here is a real nice halfway house between a 911 and a Jag XK. The 911 has more heft, more precision, more feel, wriggles in your hand, but the Jaguars is probably just a little bit too light for a real sports car. Traction is an issue in this car. The rear tyres are actually fairly narrow by modern standards, only 265s. The fronts are 235s and they're 19-inch front and rear. So on days like today, we have quite mixed road conditions, some patches of good grip, some patches of low grip. Do watch out, because if the car breaks away, it'll be quite sudden, and the traction control is not particularly smart. This car also feels quite well put together. It's not really creaking or rattling. As with all of the others in the line, the boot space is probably one of the few weak points. It's also very, very thirsty, but does now at least look and feel like a car which earns the amount you're certainly going to be spending on it. Now, Dan's only had this car a month, and in that time one thing has gone wrong with it, which is the passenger door lock. There's an issue with the barrel, which means on occasion it just locks itself, and there's no way to sort it other than to get out of the car, go around with the key and manually undo it. Unfortunately, that part is no longer available from Maserati, and sadly is not one of those items they seem to have shared with Fiat. When I do a review, I generally try and avoid reviews as much as I possibly can, because I don't want my own opinion to be tainted by that of others. However, I'd already done research on the Gransport a few years ago when I was actually thinking about buying one for myself. In all honesty, that still didn't spoil anything, because the reviews were so opposite to one another that I wasn't sure whether it was going to be a brilliant car or just another Italian dud. I'm on the side of saying, yeah, this is a good car. It's not the ultimate sports car. It doesn't have the sharpness, the edge, the refinement of a 911, but it is a step up in terms of interior quality. It sounds fabulous. It is, of course, that much more exotic. A Jaguar XKR of the period, you'd be looking at either the last of the old X100s, or, I suppose if you go a little bit later, the first of the newer X150s. In both cases, they've got regular auto boxes, which are very, very good around town. They're more comfortable things. They're in some ways more plush riding, but when pressing on, they're just not going to set your heart on fire like this really can. My first few miles on this, I've got to be honest, I was really quite concerned, because the gearbox was absolutely pants. When you're just driving it at normal speeds, it makes no sense whatsoever. Get a move on though, and it really does work. I'm not helping the gearbox at all at the minute, and it's doing exactly what I want it to. This is not really much of a surprise, to be honest, because if you drive my Quattroporte in normal mode, it's not a very good car. Put it in sport and it's absolutely brilliant. You can really tell which of the two modes the development team spent their time on. As for automatic mode, I'm not even going to try it. Seriously, there is no single clutch manual car out there where the automatic mode is anything even approaching acceptable. They're just not built for that. Is it a shame that they didn't offer this car in a manual? Yeah, I think it's a real shame. They should have done that, and then you'd have a real cult hit with this. But they had just about refined this box to a point where you can live with it. The old auto box in the 3200 was just as bad in its own way. It was really quite badly out of date. A 4-speed in 1998 or whenever it was just not acceptable. And this really is a big leap forward in many ways. It did take another few years for Ferrari and Maserati to really perfect it, and they did perfect it before binning it. The felt-lined paddles are quite an interesting thing as well. I'm not sure exactly what they were thinking with those. I think I'd rather just pure metal myself. You then pop this back into normal mode and the gear shifts suddenly become even worse because you've just about gotten used to them. And then you're reminded by how bad these systems could really be. Both up and down the car is both slow and jerky. I don't know how they quite managed that. If you drove this car without pressing the sport button, I could entirely see why you would think it was absolutely terrible, because without that button pressed, it is. It's neither sporty nor comfy. It's just a bit awkward, really. And I can imagine some people still view the whole package that way. It's got much more room in it than a 911 or an XK, but it's still not a proper four-seater if you're 6 foot. But on the other hand, if you do need occasional back seats to put real people in, these are pretty good. In truth, around town, the suspension doesn't even feel that good in normal mode. It goes back to being what I hated about Skyhook. It's still crashy, but also wallowy. It just feels all wrong. It feels like all four corners of the car have got their own agenda and none of them are talking to each other. The steering loses its connection. The whole thing just disintegrates. Maserati shouldn't have put that button in here at all. They should have taken that away entirely and just left the car in sport mode permanently, because then and only then does this make any sense. But push sport mode and I really, really like this car. So after this, the one car still remaining for me to try in the older Maserati lineup is the Spider. A very interesting car because it's actually quite different to this. It's based on the 4200 and has many of its mechanicals, but it's actually considerably shorter because it has no back seats at all. And that, I think, means it's going to deliver quite a different experience. Whether it will be better or worse, though, I'm not sure. But for now, that's enough from me. Huge thank you to Dan and his partner for bringing this car out. And to you, thanks for watching. Please like, comment down below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. I shall see you for the next one. Bye-bye.